All right. So, welcome or happy mid-morning to everybody. I will start by introducing myself. I am the Executive Director of the Duke 15Q Alliance, which represents families affected by Duke 15Q syndrome. Unlike many executive directors of patient advocacy groups represented here, I do not have a child or family member with Duke 15Q syndrome, but my dedication to Duke 15Q started out with my background in child development research in genetic disorders. So my commitment to improve clinical care and research in genetic disorders via patient advocacy is rooted in the questions and goals of the families I represent and using those goals to drive science forward. So, I'll give a little bit of history of the Duke 15Q Alliance and how we got to where we are with our research and our clinics. But first I want to ask, how many of you in this room have researchers or research programs that you guys support or direct already? About half. And then how many of you have clinicians or clinics that you can refer patients to or you can direct questions to if you need something specific answered? And another, about half, okay? So I'll kind of give you the timeline of Duke 15Q Alliance as to how we got to where we are now, and where we're going in the future. So the Duke 15Q Alliance was started in the late 90s by actually a group of 13 families that was connected by clinicians and researchers that identified the copy number variant and the significance. Since then, we've had a couple name changes because the genetics have come a long way since then. So we were IDEAS for a while, then we were isodicentric something. And so, but we finally settled on Duke 15Q Alliance, and we're probably going to keep that for a while because it's a lot of work to change a name, just so you guys know. If you're starting a patient advocacy group, be careful on names. Over time, through awareness, education, and advocacy, we've grown into an international family support system, as well as clinical and research data collection conduit. In terms of education, awareness, and support, and data collection, we have international family conferences. And as part of that, we actually collect data at our family conferences to drive research forward. We invite researchers to come, either through questionnaires or direct patient contact. They're welcome to come to our conferences and collect as much information as they want. We facilitate that. We encourage patients to bring their children there because as rare disorders happen, there's not a lot of us. So when you have families that come together in one certain location, making sure that you're facilitating research at those places is key. And doing it early, so you kind of get go over the stumbling blocks early when they're kind of small, is really also a big thing to think about. So we've had our international conferences since 2001, and every other year we have a family conference, and then every year we have a scientific symposium where we invite people that have either been doing research in Duke 15Q syndrome or are seeing patients with Duke 15Q syndrome. We invite everybody to come. If people have made a publication about the gene region, we invite them to come and present their latest findings. We really want getting people in the same room and talking about your disorder is really important. Even if they're not in it right away, even if they're seeing one patient and they've connected with you, we invite them. We want them to come. We want them to be involved in our group, in our family, as we call it. So in addition to that, we have a professional advisory board who really supports our mission and helps us cultivate the new generation of researchers and clinicians. Right now, it's a 12-member board made up of researchers, scientists, and clinical care providers. And with their guidance, we've entered into major research collaborations over the years and many research initiatives, including several stem cell repositories, the Autism Brain Net, which collects post-mortem brain tissue, the Epilepsy Leadership Council, the Child Neurology Foundation, the Alliance for Genetic Etiologies and Neurodevelopmental Disorders, and Autism. The list goes on and on. These have all happened kind of organically. It's people we've met through conferences like this, scientific conferences, other groups that we are a part of. There's a lot of conference calls involved. We don't ever see each other in person very often, except at things like this. But it's something that we really do cultivate those relationships to make them stronger and also to get our word out there. We cross-pollinate a lot. So when we present our research, like the Child Neurology Foundation will put it out on their website, and if we're looking for new postdocs, they'll also put it out there on their website. So, as resulting from our progression through history, the resulting mission of the Duke 15Q Alliance is to provide family support, promote awareness, research, and targeted treatments for Duke 15Q syndrome. Through our work to raise awareness and promote research into Duke 15Q syndrome, we fund targeted treatments so that affected individuals can live full and productive lives. Together with our families, the Alliance works towards a better tomorrow for our children with Duke 15Q. So, a little bit about DUP15Q and how we get researchers and clinicians involved. So, like I said, we've had name changes throughout the years, and even now, DUP15Q syndrome is a mouthful. We've been inverted DUP15Q, isodicentric 15Q, partial trisomy 15, tetrasomy 15Q, interstitial, it goes on. None of these things actually resonate with anybody, right? You have a name, it doesn't actually, when a researcher hears about it, they're thinking about the region of duplication. But what we really hold on to for our research and our awareness and our education is the symptomatology that goes along with it. Our kids have severe infantile hypotonia, they have subtle facial deformities, they have intellectual disability, epilepsy, particularly infantile spasms, autism spectrum disorders in most of our kids, and also sudden unexplained death. So I said a lot of buzzwords. And a lot of those buzzwords are where we get our interest from researchers and clinicians. This is when you suspect your child has autism or suspect your infant has hypotonia and you want to get to clinic, that's what you're going in for. You're not going in for the genetic test. It always ends up that you get your genetic, or often ends up that you get your genetic diagnosis. But we kind of hold on to those autism, those epilepsy, those sorts of things, because they're genetic targets. DUP15Q syndrome is a clinically identifiable disorder that has a known genetic cause, and that becomes very attractive to researchers since it's a clear genetic target for research and precision medicine. In particular, for DUP15Q syndrome, autism has been implicated in 2 to 3% of all autism spectrum disorders, and we're the most common copy number variant in autism. So that really opens our net when we're casting it for new researchers and new clinicians who could be interested in a disorder. Epilepsy is another one. More than half of our patients with DUP15Q syndrome will have at least one seizure, and SUDEP occurs in DUP15Q syndrome population at a much higher rate than any other of the epilepsies. So that's another thing that really drives people to, it's startling to say, my child might not wake up tomorrow because they may have had a seizure at night. So it's something that we can get clinicians involved and say, this is a genetic target for SUDEP. So let's get together and say, how can we design a study for SUDEP? What information can we collect from all of our families over time that, if somebody does pass away of SUDEP, what can we find from their information that they've given us over time to really drive that research question forward and find some answers? In addition, the clinical recommendations that have come out of our clinical working groups takes into account our patient and family medical goals, and it really leads towards precision medicine for those who are able to be seen at our clinics. In addition to creating guidelines for local physicians and support systems, all of these really highlight the need for a multidisciplinary approach for most rare genetic disorders. We actively support 8 DUP15Q clinics around the country, and we're actually going international in the next year, meaning that we're going to start supporting ones internationally. The growth of our clinics and the addition of new clinics comes very much from our family base. Families are being seen by physicians who take an interest in DUP15Q syndrome and who have institutional support to create a clinic or put in touch with the Alliance. And we evaluate the possibility of making them an Alliance-endorsed clinic. Right now, we're at this point that we're wrestling with the idea of quantity versus quality in our clinics, and we're not entirely sure where we're going with that, but Steve will also probably touch on that too, because the TS Alliance has clinics as well. But the biggest requirement for our clinics is to be involved in our DUP15Q international database. In addition to providing the multidisciplinary care to DUP15Q patients, each clinic collects data into our central repository for DUP15Q Alliance researchers and clinicians to use for future research projects. Each year then we also have our DUP15Q Alliance Fellowship Program. Each year, we send out an RFA for DUP15Q pre- and postdoctoral training and medical student gap year research training awards. A little bit more on that one. The DUP15Q Alliance, I'm sorry, I'm going on 2 different ones. There we go. There we go, sorry. We invite every year applications for our pre- and postdoctoral training award. The program targets graduate students, medical students, postdoctoral fellows interested in pursuing careers in basic and clinical research relevant to DUP15Q syndrome. In the past, the first RFA that we sent out, it was pretty broad, meaning that we just said anybody who's interested in DUP15Q syndrome or the genetic region, send us an application. What ended up happening is we got apples and oranges. Meaning that we had some families or some researchers who were interested in the human side, some were interested in the basic research side, some were interested in animal models, some were interested in fly models, some were interested in stem cells. So the last RFA we put out, we did 2 tracks. We did human subjects, human clinical subjects research, or basic research, because then we get into a little bit less of those apples and oranges. Because when we evaluate these proposals, we need to be able to find experts in whatever that proposal's on, and this gives us a little bit wider of a net to say, okay, here's my human subjects experts that can evaluate all those proposals, and then here's my basic and clinical research experts who can evaluate these proposals. So, which resulted is now we currently fund three, there are one's predoctoral and two are postdoctoral fellows, and they come in a couple different ones. So Kevin Hope is on a 3-year grant. I'm pretty sure that's the one, yeah. And so he is doing fruit fly research in epilepsy. Then we have James Fink, who's on a 2-year, and he's studying stem cells. And then this year we awarded our first human subjects project is Vidya Saravanan-Pandian from the University of California, Los Angeles. So this is kind of our apples and oranges, but we have amazing proposals that have come in. We've got things that really can make a difference in Dupe 15Q, the lives of kids with Dupe 15Q. And honestly, when it comes down to this, we target questions that our families want to know. Our professional advisory board is made up of scientists and researchers, but we really do listen to our families when it comes to our research and clinical aspirations, because we don't need to be spending the money that they make because we are a grassroots funded organization. We don't bring any money from sponsors. We do walks, we do mailings, and that's how we make all of our money. So spending our money wisely is really important. So what I did for this presentation and for the presentation we did for the family conference is I figured out what our cost benefit analysis was. And so over the last 5 years, we've given out $100,000 in grants. That's a lot of money for a small group like us. It took us a long time to make that, and we want to know that it's going to come back to us. So this is an example of how that $100,000 has grown. We gave out $100,000, in seed grants, and through, I think it's 3 years. It's been 3 years through research, pilot data, publications, and grant applications from the information that's been collected from that $100,000. We're now at $2.2 million in NIH grants and private funding that has come in through the researchers specific to Dupe 15Q research. So that $2.2 million is specific to Dupe 15Q. It's not one of those grants that kind of casts a wide net. It's specific to our syndrome, which is something that really invigorates families to, one, get the word out there, and two, help fundraise for our patient advocacy group. So what we've learned firsthand is how the power of patient advocacy groups can be leveraged to form better research questions and to improve clinical care specific to our syndrome. The clinical recommendations that have come out of our clinic working groups and have led towards precision medicine for those that are able to be seen at our clinics. And we've learned that cultivating relationships with young researchers leads to spreading the word about your disorder to other young researchers, encouraging presentations at conferences where those who use similar methodologies on different disorders can maybe apply it to your disorder. And careful evaluation of proposals is key to the return on investment for your group. We had, like I said before, we had cast a wide net for proposals. In some ways that may seem like a good approach. However, the result was that we were comparing those apples and oranges. We're revamping our structure to make sure that the RFAs are more directed each year and alternating basic research and human subjects research in funding years. Additionally, we have a go-to list of reviewers and readers that extends beyond our internal professional advisory board. And we hope that that group grows because that's just another way to get the advocacy and awareness for your group out there in the larger research population. The people that we've recruited to evaluate our proposals is a lot of big name hitters, and they're not necessarily good. We're never going to be able to pay them to do the research, but at least they know about us. So, any questions? Yes. Yeah. And then, so we're a small patient organization right now. We represent about 1,400 patients worldwide. Steve from the Tuberous Sclerosis Alliance will come up, and they're a much larger and much older, not really older, but older. They've been around for longer. And he's going to tell you about what they do and the pitfalls that they've overcome, and then we'll take questions at the end about everything. Okay?
Thanks, Vanessa. And thanks to the organizers for the opportunity to be here. It's a real pleasure to talk to you. Hopefully I can touch on some things that are relevant to organizations of all different sizes. I sat in on most of the session, the first session in this room this morning, and if some of those of you who were here might remember that there were questions about, there are some multi-million-dollar types of things that can be funded, but there are also things that can be done with much less money. So, do you have my slides queued up? All right, perfect. Thanks. I think I keep pushing the wrong button. There we go. So where I'd like to start is to tell you a little about the disease, and then a little about the organization, and then about some of the resources that we help make available to try to encourage and help build that next generation of researchers. So TSC is a rare disease, a genetic disorder that causes tumors to form in different organs throughout the body, most commonly in the brain, the kidneys, the lung, the heart, and on the skin. The TSC affects about 1 in 6,000 live births, so we estimate the prevalence in the US at about 50,000. So while it does qualify as an orphan disease, we realize it's not nearly as rare as some of the other disorders that many of you represent. One of the confounds, much like Annette talked about in the last session with neurofibromatosis, is that no two people with TSC are affected the same way, and not even identical twins. And we could go into the genetics and the biology of that afterward if you would like to, but there is some, there's a lot to learn about how this is happening, why it's happening, and how do we help each person with TSC understand what their particular path is going to look like when there can be such a variability. Now, even with all these tumors that form throughout the body, the most devastating effects of TSC are most often neurological. 85% of people with TSC experience epilepsy, and about 2/3 of them are intractable epilepsy, so they're not fully controlled with therapies, whether it's drug treatment or implants or things like that. And if epilepsy occurs very early, it can lead to things like developmental delay, cognitive impairment, and then perhaps the inability to live independently, because once you've interfered with development at those early years, there's really no catching up once your brain is older and more set in its ways. And much like Dup15q, autism and, as I mentioned, epilepsy are very common in this population. About 50% of people with TSC are diagnosed on the autism spectrum. So Tuberous Sclerosis Alliance is older. We were formed in 1974 by 4 moms out here in Southern California. Ever since the beginning, we've been committed in one way or another to our mission of finding a cure for tuberous sclerosis complex while improving the lives of those who are affected. We have really 3 main ways in which we do that. We develop educational materials, support programs, a number that people can call, whether they're newly diagnosed or they've been diagnosed for 40 or 50 years, ask questions and get help. We stimulate and sponsor research, and that's most of what I'll talk to you about the rest of the day. And we implement public awareness and advocacy campaigns. So we try to get the word out as much as we can among professionals and among legislators about the importance and the relevance of TSC and the importance of medical research in general. So here are a couple graphs related to the different funding sources for TSC. So on the left is a graph, a pie chart that represents, much like Vanessa was looking at, what kind of funding do people, after we've given them their first grant, what kind of funding do people get after that? A big difference between mine and Vanessa's is that these dollars are not necessarily only for TSC. There's a lot of big numbers in here, and it's very labor intensive to go through and tease through since 1984 how many of these grants are exactly focused on TSC or very relevant to TSC, or maybe TSC is a small part of them. But we've funded almost $20 million since 1984. So again, that's a long time, 33 years. But of those people that we funded, after they got their first TS Alliance grant, they obtained over $280 million from the NIH and over $13 million from the Department of Defense's Tuberous Sclerosis Complex Research Funds. So even if even if 3/4 of that NIH money is not directly related to TSC, we feel like, much as Vanessa said, that return on investment is still there. The researchers we're funding are going back and they're able to get bigger dollars and build on the smaller amounts that we were able to fund, especially in the early years. On the right, you can see the growth of funding relevant to TSC over the years. The green bars, again, represent that amount of money funded by the NIH. And you can see that in the mid-2000s, it really took off as more was learned about the biology of TSC and how the biology of TSC is related to biologies of cancers and epilepsy. The dollars that were granted by the NIH, really increased. The TSCRP, the Department of Defense's program, are the red bars. They funded about $6 million a year over the last few years. And the TS Alliance is in blue there at the bottom. So about $1 to $2 million a year, give or take, in research grants or external funding for research over those years. So you can see how in the early days, we were really important as a bigger percentage of the grant money that was available. But in later years, the NIH and the DoD are funding much more dollars than we can afford to do. So that leads us to, how do we think about how we use our dollars most effectively? How can we fit in a niche that's different than what these other funders can do? And so we've thought strategically about what it takes to develop new treatments. I use drugs as kind of the example because it's more directly worked out and it's very standardized, but this could apply to any sort of improvement in treatment, that it starts with an idea on the left and it ends with really affecting the patients, making it available to patients on the right. And so this includes things like generating hypotheses, generating new ideas, and bringing new researchers into the field so they can bring new ideas in. And we use our research grants program for that. Over on the right-hand side, we try to understand the disease and make data and resources available to researchers that will help them do research that maybe we're not funding. Maybe the NIH or the Department of Defense is funding it, but they have access to these tools that we can build. Things like a natural history database, which is a patient registry, but in our case, we actually collect the clinical data at the clinical sites. So we pay some money to 18 different clinics around the country to have the data entered locally there by them on those patients who consent to be a part of this database. And we have over 2,000 people enrolled at this point. We recently started collecting biosamples. So on the right next to the natural history database are the biosample repository. These are samples such as cheek swabs for DNA, blood draws for DNA and for plasma, tissue samples if they happen to have a medically necessary surgery, then we ask if we can get a piece of this. And these are all from people who are already enrolled in the natural history database, or we add them to it. So that it's really important we have their clinical data and we have their biosample. Because with TSC being so different from person to person, it's really not very impactful anymore to just have a set of TSC samples. It's like, well, what does that mean, right? Did they develop epilepsy when they were 3 months old, or are they an adult with kidney issues who never experienced epilepsy? So how can a researcher make sense of that if it's just a sample from somebody with TSC? So we're linking that clinical data together with the biosamples. And then we have a clinical research consortium that is a group of, right now, 7 different TSC clinics around the country that over the last 5 years have run 4 different NIH-funded clinical studies or clinical trials. And by doing that routinely and working together, they become much more efficient and effective at doing it. And we play a role we contributed some seed funding in the beginning, but now the studies are NIH funded, and what we do is spread the word about the studies. So we have the visibility on our website, social media, email blasts, things like that, where we can reach out to the community to make sure they know these clinical research studies are available so they can participate. And then finally, one of the newest projects is the Preclinical Consortium over here next to the research grants. The research grants are really to get those new ideas and those new people in the field and generate concepts about new treatments. But then what? How do they move those new treatments forward? Well, especially if it's a young investigator, and that's really one of the topics of this particular session is how do you get new people involved? Well, they probably don't have an animal model in their lab. And they could collaborate with another academic lab, but which one do they choose? There's no one model of TSC. So which model do they choose? Is it one that causes seizures? Is it one that causes tumor growth? Of the ones that cause seizures, there's a bunch of them. Which one do they choose? And so what we did was get academic researchers together to talk about which were the most reproducible, most translatable to the human disease models. And then the TS Alliance is paying for those models to be set up and tested by contract research labs so that any investigator, whether they're a young academic investigator, a senior academic investigator, or an industry investigator who has an idea for a new compound, potential new drug that might work in TSC, can access those models and have it tested in the same way every time, and it will be comparable to all the data that we collect over time in those animals. So just while we're on this slide, just to give you in summary then, it's a strategy aimed at using the dollars that we have to kind of prime the pump on the left-hand side, try to inject some new ideas, some new blood, and make it easy to test new drug hypotheses on the preclinical end. And on the far end, clinical development is far too expensive for us to support. But if we can make it more attractive for companies or the NIH to invest in clinical development by having a good understanding of the natural history, biosamples available to perhaps help develop biomarkers, and a clinical research consortium that's really good at running studies in TSC, we hope that this encourages more companies and more grant-funded researchers to be able to plug into TSC and say, they've made it real easy for me to move my ideas forward. Why don't I try them here? So there are some other science and medical programs that the TS Alliance has. We have 51 TSC clinics around the country, actually around the world. 3 of them are in Israel, 48 in the US. And we have a number of new applications this year. That gets to the quantity versus quality issue. And we can talk about how we try to at least make people aware of what's available to the clinics, even though quality is very, very difficult to judge. We sponsor a research conference. Research conferences are very powerful ways of bringing researchers together and stimulating them to collaborate or bringing them together with researchers who work on related diseases, but not necessarily your disease. And often these can be co-sponsored by other groups, other nonprofit groups, so you're not all sharing the load, or with some NIH support. The clinical trial awareness, that's something that is almost no cost. Using the connections you already have, you can help you can help researchers by reaching out to the people with TSC and making sure they're aware of clinical trials they could participate in. A clinical consensus conference. This was something we've sponsored back in 1998, and then we did an update in 2012, where we brought expert healthcare providers together to align on the consensus. What really does define a diagnosis of TSC, right? Sometimes the genetics are pretty straightforward, but what about the phenotype? What about the clinical phenotype? What should be considered TSC? And then what are the recommendations for the surveillance and the treatment of TSC? Again, this is a fairly moderate cost undertaking that doesn't have to be done every year, but it's very powerful in having your healthcare community unite around these guidelines that you can then share with insurers, with other doctors who are less familiar with TSC, that patients out who don't have access to a TSC clinic can take to their local physicians and say, in case you didn't see it, here are the consensus guidelines. And then the NIH, we have a trans NIH working group, and what I mean by that is TSC, as you heard from the first couple of slides, affects a number of different organ systems. So we interact with a number of institutes at NIH, the Neurologic Disorders and Stroke, Mental Health, Cancer Institute, Diabetes and Kidney, et cetera. So there are about 9 different institutes that we regularly interact with. And one way we do that is by getting program officers from each of those institutes together and meeting once every year or every 2 years, and together with the funders on the Department of Defense side, get together and say, okay, what are we all doing? What are the priorities? How are we all supporting advancements in TSC research and doing it in complementary ways, not duplicative ways? And are there things that we can do to move forward? And one of the outcomes from the Trans NIH Working Group a couple of years ago was NIH said, you know what, it's really time that we get a strategy and really update our research strategy as a whole around TSC, and they sponsored a workshop to do that. And so, with no cost, except we helped contribute to some of the food costs that they couldn't take on, they helped organize and plan and pay for this workshop to develop a research strategy for TSC. So that's a resource that you can reach out to, at essentially no cost. And so I want to summarize and bring it back to the original topic, that next generation of clinicians and researchers. Because I've talked a lot about several projects that we have, but let's bring it back to those early career folks. Well, through the research grants, it's pretty straightforward. We have a postdoctoral grants program, so we fund postdoctoral fellows, and many of those, not all of course, but many continue to stay in the field for longer periods of time. So it's a way of investing a relatively small amount of money in a very promising researcher in a great lab and get them started on potentially a long career in TSC research. We also sponsor the research conference, and we sponsor travel awards. So the travel awards are really focused on bringing postdoctoral fellows to the conference. They submit abstracts, the abstracts are reviewed, the ones with the most kind of impressive stories to tell are invited to give a talk or at least give a poster, and we help offset the costs of their attendance at the conference. Again, not a huge expense, but one way of encouraging those, that next generation. As I mentioned, the Preclinical Consortium gives access to drug testing. It's not unique to next generation researchers, but it is available to them equally as with all researchers. And on the biosample repository, access to human biosamples, something that takes, some established labs at major TSC clinics might have their own collection. Some of them do have their own collection of TSC tissue or DNA samples. But with our repository, these are available to all researchers anywhere, regardless of whether they have a lot of funding or a little bit of funding, as long as they'll be able to do good work with the samples. The natural history database, again, access to clinical data that we've collected over the years are freely available to that next generation of researchers and clinicians. And of course, participation of fellows in clinical studies. One of the things I didn't talk about in our clinical research consortium is that it's not the PIs that do all the work. There's a lot of study coordinators who do the work, and there's also a lot of involvement in fellows. It's both a little bit cheaper labor, and it's a learning experience for them, and it often gets them hooked on TSC research for a while. And so by partnering with the Clinical Research Consortium, it's often possible to get that next generation involved. So I'll wrap it up there. Hopefully it's given you a few ideas for thought, but if you have any questions for Vanessa or myself, this would be a great time. We've still got quite a bit of time left. Vanessa, you want to come on up here?
Do we have any questions?
When you are funding your postgrad and fellows, you said that many. Is there a target number? Because in our case, for my disease, many of the researchers are in their late 50s to mid 60s. So we're trying to get the next generation going. And I didn't know, are you saying over 50% or 80% when you talk about doing postgrad that they end up staying in or at least spending time in that field of research?
I can take a quick, so on my answer, I would say probably 40 to 50%. And the reason I make that estimate is because on that graph I showed, the pie chart where we track what funding people got, there are, about 40 or 50% of them are getting active funding. And most of those are in, maybe all of those are in TSC, at least in the first few years. Because they tend to take what they do as a postdoctoral fellow and that becomes their first project in their own lab. And then we have, another about 50 or 60% that don't have any subsequent funding. So they've moved on, maybe they went to industry, maybe they went to teaching, but not an independent academic lab.
We're a lot younger than TS Alliance, but I would say about 70% of the dollars that we've put in to either junior faculty or even senior faculty for mouse development have stayed with Dup15q or the related genetic area. So ours is a duplication. The deletion is actually Angelman syndrome, so it's the Prader-Willi area. So they stay within the same genetic region. So it's something that even if it's not necessarily Dup15q syndrome, it can inform the genetic area. So, but I would say right now we're about 70, but it might fall because we're quite a bit younger.
Question up front.
Great.
and then one over there.
Vanessa, I couldn't read your slide that said you had a dollar amount for your your postdocs. What is a reasonable grant award?
Oh, sorry.
For-
So for Vidya, we are giving her $25,000 towards, most of it goes to her salary because she is getting a matching grant. So when our proposals come in, a lot of them do come in with letters of support from their institutions that their institutions will match whatever we give.
Okay.
So $25,000 will maybe, I think, postdocs at UCLA, that's probably about half of her salary for the year. So it's definitely not covering all of her, but at least it gets her.
But that's a reasonable grant
That's
award.
that's
we
a reasonable
could-
amount for a small advocacy group to give.
Uh-huh.
There is NIH guidelines for postdoc salary are public, so if you just Google NIH guidelines postdoc salary or pre-doc salary, it's out there. A lot of times institutions do pay more because it's really not a living wage. Honestly.
Not at all.
No, it's not, it's really not great. So as long as you're kind of around that or a percentage of that, that's the justification you can put in as to why you do the amounts. So yeah, we're right around $25,000 a year because in our operating budget, we say we dedicate $150,000 a year to research. And so that covers our postdoc or our fellows for as many years as we've agreed, and then plus new ones along the way.
And
So-
does that change from university to university? And do you put out that proposal just to one university, or is it like you're papering the town with?
For the RFAs?
Yes.
So the RFAs go to our entire science, so it goes to anybody who's ever attended a science conference, we do put it out on social media. Again, our partners, so all of those partners that I listed, like the Child Neurology Foundation, the Epilepsy Foundation, Autism Speaks, Autism Science Foundation, we send it to them too. So it goes out we paper the town. Because when it comes to Do 15Q, like I said, we stay with the symptoms more than anything. So it could be an autism specific or Do 15Q syndrome autism specific proposal, or it could be a genetic region for the preclinical models. So we paper the town. We kind of go to the autism ones, we go to the epilepsy ones, and then we go to the genetic ones, like the Angelman Syndrome Foundation. They'll put it out to their researchers as well.
Thank you.
While he's walking the mic back, yeah, I might say when we put out calls for proposals like this, it's clear how much we would pay, what's the maximum we would pay. So folks where that wouldn't be acceptable, maybe their institution doesn't have a match, they wouldn't apply, and that's fine. So it's not like you spring it on them as a surprise. It's all up front, and so it works out.
The other thing is for amounts, when you're allocating different amounts and you're thinking about it for your budgetary purposes, when you give a grant, the institution usually requests indirect costs. Probably some people in the room know what that is, some people don't. It's a percentage, the amount you're gonna give, they're gonna say, you owe that plus 75%. So if you give $1 million, they want $1,750,000. What we do as an organization in our bylaws, we say we don't pay indirect costs. So that's another thing that you don't spring on them. Some institutions won't accept grants that don't pay indirect costs because it covers all their administrative costs in giving that money to that researcher. But many, when you're talking about young researchers especially, they're more likely to accept it. They're more likely to say, yes, this is a junior researcher, we need somebody to support them anyways, and they're gonna be okay with it. But definitely, if you're thinking about creating a research program like this, thinking about what indirect costs you're able to pay or nothing at all. So as long as it's in your bylaws and it's published that you don't pay them or whatever percent you are okay with paying, that it's there and it's online so that the institution can find it, you should be okay. Do you guys pay indirect costs?
Yes, so we pay 10%, so we have a 10% cap. So it's, in a way, it's nominal. It helps cover the costs of their contracts office, processing everything and all of that. And it's easier to swallow than none, but it's not at the same rate that NIH pays, for sure.
I wonder if you could talk about your alliance, Alliance Endorsed Clinics. Does that it mean that you're giving them financial support every year, and do you have a checklist, or how would a clinic become eligible, or, is that revisited, that sort of things?
I'll talk about the younger version, and then you can talk about him. So our clinics basically started with the clinicians who were involved in finding what Do 15Q was in our case. So our clinics, we do support them financially. We Some don't request financial support, so at that point, we say, that's fine, you can go ahead to that. What we do is we have them, we request that they have a dedicated research, or clinic coordinator that does the intake for all of our families. So when a family calls, they have a special number, a person that they call. So not just calling, they're not calling children or Mass General Hospital and saying, I want to go to Duke 15Q clinic. They're calling a specific person. They're saying, hey, Karen, I want to come to the Duke 15Q clinic and see Dr. Thiebert. Can I get in there? And that person, Karen knows, oh yeah, Duke 15Q, this is what they need to see. This is what they're going to offer them in terms of the multidisciplinary way that we structure our clinics. So that's kind of what we pay for. We pay for that clinical coordinator when we do pay. We are revamping our structure that we're doing a per patient. So if they see a patient, they get an allocation for each patient that they see. So we get a readout at the end of the year. They've done 50 or 100 Duke 15Q visits, then they get that money. If they do less, then they get less. The other thing is that we request for the checklist, they have to have, they have to do the database, meaning that they have to have a person that's going to input the data from the clinical visit. They have to have access to a pediatric neurologist or a neurologist, depending upon the age of the duper. They have to have access to a GI consult if the family wants one. They have to have access to phenotyping, so cognitive assessments and that sort of thing, because we want to know about autism, intellectual disability, ADHD, and all of those great things. Psychiatry, often, as our kids get older, we have a psychiatrist need, so that they have to have access to psychiatry. And then there was one more. And then most of our clinics do have access to an epileptologist outside of the pediatric neurologist because of the seizure side of our kids. So we do have a checklist that goes into it. So when a family comes to us and says, my neurologist is amazing, I want to have a clinic in rural Mississippi. No, because we do follow up. We say, okay, it's great that you want to be part of our clinics, but here's all the things that you need to be able to house in your institution. And most of them come back and say, I can't. Which is fine. And what we'd say is that's great. If you're willing to give that duper amazing care where you are, we're going to make you part of our clinic's working group. We're going to keep you apprised of all the recommendations that our clinicians make, and that's what we do. So we keep them kind of in the fold in the family, but they're not a Duke 15Q sponsored clinic. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does.
Okay. And you can talk about the older
The
clinics.
dupers, I like that.
The dupers. They're super dupers.
So we don't pay anything to support the clinics. Now, back when we started and we're trying to get that first, second, third clinic going, I'm told we did do that, and we did offer some funding to get things going. But now it's off and rolling.
How are they endorsed, though?
How are they endorsed? The process is very, very similar. So we have an application. So our clinical advisors really came up with some suggestions. It went to our board of directors. They approved this. And so we have a board-approved application that has really the minimum requirements, and we also have some gold, sort of gold star standards, if you will, so that people can be clinics as long as they've got the minimum, but they might have some of these extra things too. And so what we do is then we put all of that on our website, so then people can go there, and it's not a Yelp sort of rating and comments by I had a terrible visit, 1 star, it's really just the facts as we know them about the kinds of services they provide, both the core services and the gold level type extra things like participating in clinical research and things like that not every clinic, not every good clinic will do or could do, but yeah, so it's very standardized.
Okay, and are you revisiting them every few years?
We do, yeah. We ask them to update their records every year. And if anything drops off the list, then, or if we kind of lose contact, somebody moves on, nobody picks up the ball. There are a couple of them that have been taken off the list because there was nobody there to keep it going.
So I'm going to ask a question from the app and then give it to this gentleman, and then I'll go back to the front of the room. Do you maintain a central database? And if so, how do you avoid individual researchers from creating their own?
From the younger perspective, and then
Yeah.
So we maintain a membership database, or we have in the past maintained a membership database as well as our clinic database. We're in the process of revamping it, that it's all going to be the same. So we recently we're bringing it in-house so that the Alliance owns it. It doesn't exist anywhere else. It's just ours. We don't inhibit anybody from making their own database. The issue that comes up, what we really tout to our researchers and clinicians is that we're the ones that have most of them. So you can, it's in rare disorders especially, you can have your own, but you're only gonna see 10 patients maybe. If you really want to answer a question about DUP15Q and the whole DUP15Q, you need to come and like access our database or ask us for access to our database. And that's kind of, I mean, we don't inhibit it. We don't say you can't do it. If you're doing research at your own institution and you've gotten your IRB approval and the patients have consented to be in your database, that's great. Fantastic, wonderful. I'm encouraging that research, but when it comes down to answering the larger questions that the Alliance really backs up and the families really want to know, we do have that centralized database that we put in our information, the clinics put in their information, and as well as we do have family surveys that go out from that database directly into there. So we separated out that who enters the data, we know who enters the data, but when we ask those questions, larger questions, we can say, okay, this is all of the answers we have from everybody, this is what we can get, so.
Yeah, I think that's a great perspective. We don't inhibit or, discourage anybody really from doing anything. We try to encourage them to do it with us and with collaborators by having it centrally.
I just had a question about the research grants, and then you had mentioned that you had matching funds from the institutions, academic institutions. Was there best practices to go about that with getting the matching grants from an academic institution?
A good advisor, especially when we're talking about postdocs and pre-docs, a good advisor who's going to go to bat for you is often what ends up happening. We don't do negotiations for it usually. It just comes, we get a letter from either the dean or the chancellor, whoever is the, next head of that person. But the advisors are usually the ones that go to the dean and say, I have this great pre-doc, I don't have any money for them, but DUP15Q Alliance is willing to give us, $25,000 a year. Can the department put in another 20 or 25 to cover the costs?
So it's not necessarily a requirement on your end. It's just something that you can ask or,
Yep.
hope for.
It's true. Yep,
Okay.
It's not a requirement on our end. We put out there as much as we're gonna give, and then it's up to them to fill in the blanks.
I'm going to ask another question submitted through the app. What is your advice to the ultra-rare patients and undiagnosed patients in catching the interest of and collaborating with researchers?
So, catching the eye. So I don't know if you guys have Google Alerts, right? If you set up your Google Alert, you just put in like either the gene region that you're talking about or the name of the whatever, like whatever it is, with the syndrome, putting it into Google, putting it into your NIH, the PI, it's the PubMed search, putting in an alert on that. Because anytime somebody has a case study on a patient that is that rare, there's corresponding author information. So say somebody has one patient somewhere that they do a case study on, it gets published through PubMed or it shows up on Google. Or even if it's somebody, like I've recently found an undergrad who did a comparison between a DUP15Q patient and an Angelman patient as their undergrad thesis at Purdue. And it showed up on my Google search. And I'm like, I am calling that lady. So I called the advisor and I said, well, I'm really interested as to how this came about. And so now we're going to collaborate with them. Their advisors, it's not the undergrads, but the advisors to go to kind of move forward as to how they got into that and possibly bring them back into that family. So it's setting up those kind of alerts and either Googling it and really saying, it's no shame. You email that person, they have an interest, they publish something or they put a story out there about your disorder, email them. And say, I either have a child with that, I'm a patient with that, I want to know why you did this and I want to get involved. I want you to get involved. I want to move this forward. And even if they can't, they might know somebody else who can. Because if they've went so far as to either write a case study up or write something about it, they're probably going to know somebody or another family that has it randomly. When you come to all these ultra rare disorders, it's the random connections and it's not about what you know, it's about who you know. Every day. There was somebody who one of our kids got a horse named after him. No idea. Ends up being in the paper, and somebody saw the paper and said, oh, my kid has that same disorder. Had never found the Alliance, had never met the person from the town over, and they got together, and now they're part of the Alliance. They have a great connection. So it's really just kind of keeping your eyes and your ears open, both on the internet, on social media, on those Google alerts, just if it comes across there, and following up.
I'll also advocate for talking to folks at the NIH about that. I have the advantage that our office is in Silver Spring, Maryland. It's like 20 minutes from from NIH if there are no accidents. So I'm over there a lot, and they're great people. They're very friendly. They would love nothing more than to contribute in the advancement of research. That's why they have their jobs. And I would, you could search, you might know what institute you're associated with. I mean, let's say a rare epilepsy, okay? It's neurologic disorders and stroke. But you might not know which institute you're most closely associated with. You might be able to see what which institute, just talk to some of your researchers. Where do you get your funds, right? Who funds this? Or you can search online. There's an NIH reporter tool that's online, and you can see what grants are funded with certain keywords or diseases or whatever. Find out which institutes are funding those, and then make some calls. You can call the office of the director, or you could call a program officer. All of their phone numbers and things are public record. I'm not saying it's easy to figure out who in there you're supposed to call, but if you want to, email me or call me, let me know, and I can give you some guidance maybe on who to reach out to. But the folks at NIH, I think in that case where there isn't a core of researchers working and it's this ultra-rare disease, I think they would be very willing to talk about and think about what sort of a workshop might be beneficial to bring, it might be a dozen people, it might be 25 people, but bring them together with some of the patients and patient advocates and talk about what could be done. Have them talk about their science, and when they talk about it to each other, they might see how it overlaps. They might see new opportunities to work together, and it might be able to get some things kick-started.
Hi, I might have, hi. I might have missed, but I wanted to double back on the database. Do you guys ever charge anyone to get into your database, or do you just leave it fee-free? The question comes up, we have a registry, not the natural history registry, but to get into that registry, it's been brought up by Genetic Alliance and that sort of thing. Like, who do you charge, who do you not charge? Do you offer it free to your medical advisory board? Those kind of things, or is it just an open registry?
So we don't, currently we offer it free to our medical advisory board and our professional advisory board and their affiliates if they would like. There is a application process so that they have to come through, they have to have IRB approval and that sort of thing. Externally we do. We charge, if there is grant funding available for whatever study they're talking about, we would charge, yeah, okay. Because it's not free to get the data, yeah. And we don't. But it's pretty nominal. It's just basically that they're putting their money where their mouth is, that they're going to come through. Because the issue is if we give access to people, give access to data to people that don't end up giving some sort of financial contribution, you never know where that's going to go. At least if you're putting your hope, they're putting money in where our hope is going. Mm-hmm. So if they're asking a certain question, you say, yes, okay, you can have all the data for that question for $5,000. At least if they've given us the $5,000 and they never publish anything, mm-hmm. then we got $5,000. Mm-hmm. Yeah. If they didn't, then we would be really sad because we did all this work for nothing. So.
Yeah. And I'll address it talking about two different types of databases. So the one with the clinical data, our natural history database, we don't charge anyone for it. We want that to be available. Now it's not freely available, like anybody can just log in and find it. The way that we handle that, and I think is sort of towards getting at make sure it's used properly and that information is going to be shared, is that they put in a request of the questions that they want to ask. So what is it they want to learn from the database, and how are they going to do this? And we run it by our steering committee of clinical researchers who have helped design this from the very beginning, and get their feedback on, are these questions appropriate for the way the data was collected, for the types of data that are in there, yes or no. And as long as it is, then we'll pull that set of data that's relevant to their question and give that to them. So it's a little bit different. We also want responsible use, mm-hmm. But rather than put the financial thing in, we take on the added work, which is we have more money, so we can do that. So it's not a right or a wrong. We're in different places. Right. And then the other type of database is simply a contact database, right? So we have, with approximately 50,000 people in the U.S., we have a contact database that probably has 8,000 to 10,000 people with TSC or their caregiver, but only 2,000 in the natural history database. So there's a lot more that we can reach through email or mail or whatever. So for that kind of thing, let's say a company wants to put out an announcement, of some kind, and they want to reach some subset, then yes, we will ask for an agreement. We'll have a memorandum of understanding or a contract or something that says, we will do this to this subset of people. This is what you want to communicate. It's relevant to our population. It's got to be good to do, or we wouldn't do it. But that's something that we would do, and then we wouldn't give them the list. We would do the distribution.
You would do the distribution.
So it kind of depends on what kind of data you're talking about. But from the research perspective, we want to encourage the use. So that's why we don't put
Okay.
a barrier.
I think we have time for one more question. Excuse me.
It's not really a question, but I just kind of wanted to put this out there because it goes along with what you guys were talking about. So we're a new parent organization, and we have just started our natural history database, but we're using a company that's been funded through money that's been donated for autism. So our kids have autism, and well, that's one of their characteristics, just like you as well. And so we were able to tap into that. And so, looking for those type of opportunities to use those type of resources, which actually costs us nothing. And so they're available out there, you just have to find them. And so this has been really great for us, and I just got an updated, we have 50 families right now that are in the database, so this is just awesome. So it's really been really a great resource for us.
Just an aside, if anybody is creating databases, be careful. Talk to other patient advocacy groups. Be very careful. There's a lot of companies out there that sound really good, and they're not. So just talk to other patient advocacy groups that you're not spending hundreds of thousands of dollars or even thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars on something that's not going to work for you in the long run because they have other interests. They have their own interests in mind. So just be careful. I know that we've learned from our mistakes, put it that way. So, but just be careful when you're talking about databases, especially free is good.
So thank you, Vanessa and Steve. So let's give them another round of applause for some great information and learning how to work with researchers and clinicians.